Ambassador Aloya Kara nervously smoothed her shimmering golden gown as the shuttle approached the imposing human warship, Indomitable. She had always been a shy and reserved diplomat, more comfortable with quiet negotiations than bold confrontations. But with tensions between the Sorlava Confederacy and Earth at an all-time high, she had no choice but to face humanity's representatives head-on. As the shuttle docked and the airlock hissed open, Aloya took a deep breath, steeling herself. She stepped out into the hangar bay, her emerald skin flushing darker with anxiety as she took in the sight of the human honor guard awaiting her. Her gaze was immediately drawn to the two men at the forefront. One was an older, distinguished-looking gentleman in a crisp suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed Secretary of Interstellar Relations Alexander Romanov, whom she recognized from her briefings. But it was the other man who made her heart race with a mix of fear and something far more unsettling. He was tall and powerfully built, with chiseled features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He wore a high-tech combat exoskeleton that only emphasized his raw, savage masculinity. Commander Tychus Raven, the Butcher of Bloody Gulch. Aloya had to fight the urge to shrink back under his intense gaze, a shiver running through her. This man was a legend, a brutal warrior known for his ruthless efficiency on the battlefield. What was he doing at a diplomatic summit? Secretary Romanov stepped forward with a polite smile. Ambassador Kalara, welcome aboard the Indomitable. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. Of course, Secretary Romanov, Aloya replied, proud of how steady she kept her voice. I hope we can find a path to peace between our peoples. Commander Raven let out a low, dismissive snort, making Aloya flinch. Peace, he rumbled, his deep voice sending a traitorous thrill down her spine. That's a pretty word, but we all know this is about the core lava finally learning their place. Aloya bristled at his words even as a part of her quailed at the sheer arrogant confidence he radiated. Commander Raven, she said coolly, I assure you the Sorlava Confederacy has no intention of simply rolling over for Earth's demands. We are here to negotiate in good faith. Raven's lips curled in a smile that was more predatory than amused. We'll see about that, little ambassador. I think you'll find the Indomitable has a way of changing perspectives. With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving Aloya feeling distinctly off balance. Romanov gave her an apologetic look. You must forgive the commander's bluntness, ambassador. He's a soldier, not a diplomat. Shall we proceed to the negotiation room? Aloya could only nod, following the secretary on unsteady legs. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had just walked into the den of a savage beast, a beast with piercing blue eyes and a smile that made her knees weak and her heart race. Goddess help her. This was going to be even more difficult than she had feared. How was she supposed to stand strong for her people when just being in Tychus Raven's presence made her feel like a flustered schoolgirl? She could only pray that she would find the strength and composure she needed. The fate of the Sorlava Confederacy hung in the balance. The negotiation room was surprisingly comfortable, with plush chairs and a gleaming conference table, but Aloya barely noticed the amenities. Her attention focused on the two men seated across from her. Secretary Romanov was all polite smiles and diplomatic platitudes, but Commander Raven lounged in his chair like a predator at rest, his gaze never leaving Aloya. She shifted uncomfortably, feeling like a mouse under the eye of a hawk. Ambassador Kalara. Romanov began, I think we can all agree that the current tensions between our peoples are untenable. Earth deeply desires a peaceful resolution, but we must address the Sorlava Confederacy's continued aggression and expansionism. Aloya took a deep breath, trying to ignore Raven's unsettling presence. Secretary Romanov, I must protest. The Sorlava are not the aggressors here. We are simply defending our sovereign territory from human encroachment. Raven let out a harsh bark of laughter. Is that what you call it? Defending your territory like you defended it at Bloody Gulch? Aloya paled, her hands trembling slightly atop the table. The mere mention of that awful battle made her feel ill. So much death, so much destruction. Commander Raven, I hardly think she began, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. No, let's talk about Bloody Gulch, Ambassador. Let's talk about how your elite warriors slaughtered innocent human civilians, men, women, children, butchered them in the streets. His voice was low and controlled, but Aloya could hear the rage simmering beneath the surface. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his burning gaze. What happened at Bloody Gulch was a tragedy, she said softly, one that the core lava deeply regret. But it was not an act of aggression, Commander. It was a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding that escalated out of control. Raven surged to his feet, looming over her. A misunderstanding? He snarled. Is that what you call it when your soldiers paint the streets red with human blood? Aloya shrank back in her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had never felt so small, so vulnerable, as she did in the face of this human's raw, savage fury. Please, Commander, she whispered, hating the tremor in her voice. I am not here to defend the indefensible. I am here to find a way forward for both our peoples. For a long, tense moment, Raven stared down at her, his jaw clenched and his eyes hard. Then, slowly, he retook his seat, some of the rage leaching from his posture. Fine, he bit out. Let's find a way forward, Ambassador. But know this Earth will not tolerate any further Kaiser lava aggression. If your people step out of line again, we will end you permanently. Aloya could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Secretary Romanov cleared his throat, breaking the heavy silence. Perhaps it would be best if we adjourn for now, he suggested diplomatically. We can reconvene tomorrow, after we've all had a chance to rest and reflect. Aloya seized on the reprieve like a lifeline. Yes, I think that would be wise. Thank you, Secretary. She rose on shaky legs, barely registering Romanov's polite farewell as she fled the room. It wasn't until she was safely back in her quarters, the door sealed shut behind her, that she allowed herself to collapse, her whole body trembling. Tychus Raven terrified her, his raw power, his barely leashed rage, the way he looked at her like he could see straight into her soul. It was too much. How was she supposed to negotiate with a man like that? And yet, even as she huddled there on the floor, trying to slow her racing heart, a small, traitorous part of her couldn't help but remember the way his eyes had blazed with passion, the way his voice had rumbled through her like distant thunder. Goddess help her, but some dark, secret part of her was drawn to him, attracted to his savage intensity, his barely tamed ferocity. What was wrong with her? She was a diplomat, not some love-struck fool. She couldn't afford to be distracted by base desires, not when her people were counting on her. But even as she told herself that, Aloya knew it was a losing battle. Tychus Raven had gotten under her skin, and try as she might, she couldn't shake him loose. All she could do was pray for strength and hope that somehow she could find a way to make peace with the humans before they destroyed the Sorlava or before Tychus Raven destroyed her. The next few days passed in a blur of tense negotiations and uneasy meetings. Secretary Romanov remained unfailingly polite, but Commander Raven seemed to take every opportunity to unsettle Aloya, his mere presence sending her heart racing and her concentration scattering. He would loom behind her as she pored over star charts, his heat and scent enveloping her until she could barely think. He would brush past her in the narrow corridors, his armor barely grazing her skin, leaving her flushed and flustered. And always, always he watched her with those piercing blue eyes, like a predator stalking its prey. It was driving Aloya to distraction, and she feared it was beginning to show. Her arguments lacked their usual sharpness, her counterpoints coming a beat too slow. She could feel the negotiations slipping away from her, Earth's demands growing more and more unreasonable. But what could she do? She was a diplomat, trained to use words and reason as her weapons. How could she hope to stand against a man like Tychus Raven, who seemed to embody raw, savage force? It all came to a head one evening as Aloya sat in her quarters, trying to massage away a pounding headache. A chime at the door startled her, and she rose wearily to answer it, expecting Secretary Romanov with yet another list of demands. But when the door slid open, it was Commander Raven who stood there, filling the doorway with his bulk. Aloya's heart leapt into her throat, and she took an involuntary step back. Commander Raven, she said, hating the breathless quality of her voice. What are you doing here? He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, the door sliding shut behind him with a hiss that sounded ominous in the sudden quiet. I think it's time for a little chat, Ambassador, he said, his deep voice sending shivers down her spine. Just you and me. No diplomats or politicians to muddy the waters. Aloya swallowed hard, her mouth gone dry. I don't think that's appropriate, Commander. We should keep our discussions to the negotiation table. Raven let out a low, dark chuckle, stalking closer to her. Always so proper, aren't you, Ambassador? Always hiding behind your rules and your protocols. But I see through you. He was close now, so close she could feel the heat radiating off his armor, smelled the musk of his skin beneath the sharp tang of metal and circuitry. Aloya's heart raced, her skin prickling with a heady mix of fear and something far more dangerous. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, her back hitting the wall as she retreated before him. There was nowhere left to run, nowhere to hide from the intensity of his gaze. "Don't you?" Raven braced one armored arm against the wall beside her head, caging her in. "I've seen the way you look at me, Aloya. The way your breath catches when I'm near, the way your pulse races beneath your skin." His other hand came up, a single armored finger tracing the delicate line of her jaw. Aloya shuddered, her eyes fluttering shut of their own accord. "You're attracted to me," Raven murmured, his breath hot against her ear. Terrified, yes, but also attracted. "Don't bother denying it." Aloya swallowed convulsively, trying to gather the tattered shreds of her composure. "It doesn't matter what I feel, Commander. We can't. Our peoples shake." His finger pressed gently against her lips, silencing her. "Forget our peoples, just for a moment. This is about you and me, Aloya. This thing between us." His hand slid into her hair, his armored fingers surprisingly gentle as they cradled the back of her head. Aloya's heart thundered in her chest, her whole body trembling with a mix of terror and anticipation. "Tell me you don't want this," Raven whispered, his lips a hair's breadth from hers. "Tell me to stop, and I will. But if you want me, even a little bit, then be brave, my shy little ambassador. Take what you want." Aloya knew she should push him away, knew she should scream or slap him or knee him in the groin. He was the enemy, a savage brute who had slaughtered her people. She should hate him. But goddess help her, she didn't. In that moment, all she wanted was to feel his lips on hers, his hands on her skin. All she wanted was him. Tychus, she breathed, and then his mouth was on hers, hot and hungry and demanding. Aloya moaned, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck, her fingers tangling in his short hair. He growled against her lips, his armored body pressing her into the wall as he claimed her mouth, his tongue invading, conquering, possessing. It was madness. It was ecstasy. It was everything Aloya had ever wanted and everything she had never dared to dream of. The shy, reserved diplomat melted away, replaced by a woman of fire and passion, a woman who met Tychus Raven's savage intensity with her own. Armor and clothing fell away, forgotten, as they lost themselves in each other. And there, in the heart of the enemy ship, Aloya surrendered to the desperate, aching need that had consumed her from the moment she first laid eyes on the savage, beautiful human male. Tomorrow, there would be consequences. Tomorrow, she would have to face the reality of what she had done, the betrayal of her people and her duty. But tonight she was his, and he was hers, and nothing else mattered. Aloya awoke slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known existed. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she felt so deliciously sore. Then it all came rushing back: the negotiations, Tychus Raven's sudden appearance in her quarters, the way he had taken her against the wall, on the bed, on every surface imaginable, the way she had begged for more, her shyness and reserve burned away by the sheer, savage force of his passion. Aloya sat up with a gasp, clutching the sheet to her bare chest. What had she done? She had betrayed her people, her duty, everything she believed in. And for what? A night of forbidden pleasure with a human brute. Beside her, Tychus stirred, his eyes blinking open. He looked different in the morning light, his chiseled features softened by sleep, his blue eyes hazy and warm, almost vulnerable. "Morning," he rumbled, his voice rough with sleep. He reached for her, but Aloya flinched away, shame and guilt flooding through her. This was a mistake," she whispered, unable to meet his gaze. "We shouldn't have. I shouldn't have." Tychus sat up, his brow furrowing. "Aloya," no, she shook her head, blinking back sudden tears. "Don't, please. I can't do this, Tychus. I'm a diplomat, an ambassador. My duty is to my people, not to my own selfish desires." She forced herself to look at him, to meet his piercing gaze head on. "Last night was incredible, but it can't happen again. We have to focus on the negotiations, on finding a way to make peace between our peoples. Anything else is a distraction we can't afford." For a long moment, Tychus just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly he nodded. "You're right," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The negotiations are what matter. We can't let personal feelings get in the way of that." Personal feelings. Was that all this was to him? Aloya's heart clenched, but she forced herself to nod, to keep her expression calm and professional. I'm glad we understand each other, Commander Raven, she said, hating the way her voice wavered slightly on his name. I should go. Secretary Romanov will be expecting me. She could feel Tychus watching her, his gaze heavy on her bare skin, but she refused to look at him. If she did, she feared her resolve would crumble, that she would throw herself back into his arms and damn the consequences. Somehow, she managed to dress herself, but her fingers fumbling with the fastenings of her gown. She was just reaching for her combs when Tychus spoke, his voice low and intense. Aloya. She froze, her heart stuttering in her chest. Slowly, she turned to face him, steeling herself for what she might see in his eyes. But what she saw there made her breath catch in her throat. It wasn't anger or indifference or even lust. It was tenderness, understanding, and beneath that, a fierce, unwavering determination. I know you're scared, he said softly, holding her gaze with his own. I know you think this is a betrayal of your duty, your people. But Aloya, what if it's not? What if this thing between us? What if it's the key to bringing our peoples together? Aloya stared at him, hardly daring to breathe. What? What do you mean? Tychus rose from the bed, heedless of his own nudity. He crossed to her in 2 long strides, his hands coming up to cradle her face with a gentleness that made her heart ache. Think about it, he urged, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheekbone. You and me, we're proof that humans and Sorlava can come together, can find common ground. If we can do it, why can't our peoples? Aloya's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. Could he be right? Could their forbidden attraction really hold the key to peace between their warring races? I don't know, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's too much, Tychus. I'm just one person, and you. I'm just a man, he said firmly. A man who's tired of war, tired of the endless bloodshed and hatred. A man who's found something worth fighting for in you. Aloya's breath hitched, her eyes stinging with sudden tears. Tychus, I know it won't be easy, he said, his forehead coming to rest gently against hers. I know there will be obstacles, opposition from both our peoples. But Aloya, I believe in this. In us. And I'm willing to fight for it if you are. For a long moment, Aloya couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Her mind whirled with the enormity of what he was proposing, the risks and the challenges and the sheer dizzying possibility of it all. But in the end, there was only one answer she could give, only one path forward for her and for her people. Yes, she whispered, her hands coming up to cover his where they cradled her face. Yes, Tychus, I'm with you. We'll fight for this. For us and for the future of both our peoples. The smile that broke across his face was blinding in its intensity, fierce and joyous and full of promise. He surged forward, claiming her mouth in a kiss that seared her to her.